What if a marriage began with a cruel bet, but ended in a way that no one could have predicted? A millionaire marries an overweight woman for a bet and is surprised when... is a story full of betrayals, surprises, and exciting twists and turns that will have you gripped every second. Want to know how this explosive plot unfolds? Subscribe to the channel now, like the video, and discover how this story will move you. The sky, tinged with gold and orange, seemed the perfect prelude to another night of excess in George Grant's life. The luxurious penthouse where he lived, with glass walls offering a panoramic view of the city, was the usual venue for extravagant parties, business meetings, and moments of solitude. At 32, George was more than a millionaire. He was a symbol of success and sophistication, someone who seemed to have the world at his fingertips. His mansion was a masterpiece of opulence, full of details that highlighted his fortune and good taste. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers hanging like sparkling waterfalls, and custom-made furniture. There that evening, he welcomed the select circle of friends who shared his lifestyle. The group, made up of men and women from high society, was spread out in the main lounge. They laughed loudly, drank champagne from exclusive bottles, and talked about the pleasures that only money could provide. At the center of the group was Ethan, George's best friend since college, a man known for his sharp tongue and delight in creating situations that challenged those around him. Ethan studied George carefully, like a poker player analyzing his opponent. He knew his friend well, and knew when George was bored. Despite being the host, there was something in the way George interacted, a protocol smile, a cynical glint in his eye, that revealed how much he felt above it all. "You seem particularly insufferable tonight, George," commented Ethan, with a mischievous grin, raising his glass of whiskey. His teasing tone immediately attracted the attention of the others. George, who was reclining in an Italian leather armchair, raised an eyebrow. "And why do you think that, Ethan?" "Because you're always insufferable when you think you're king of the world," Ethan continued, leaning forward, his voice full of defiance. "It's too easy for you. Everything. Women, business, sycophantic friends. You live in a world where no one says no to you. Where's the fun in that?" The others laughed, but there was an underlying nervousness in the room. Ethan was known for pushing boundaries, and George, although often playful, also had an explosive temper when he felt challenged. George narrowed his eyes, interested. "If you have any great ideas to get me out of boredom, Ethan, I'm listening." Ethan smiled like a predator who has finally cornered his prey. "Yes, I do. A bet. A game that will test whether you really are the irresistible man everyone here believes you to be." Murmurs of excitement began to spread. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" asked George, curiosity flickering in his gaze. "Simple," replied Ethan, his voice laden with malice. "You always choose the most beautiful women, the most perfect. They fall at your feet as if it were natural. But would you be able to win over someone outside the norm?" Silence settled over the room. Some began to exchange glances, while others laughed, anticipating where this might lead. "Outside the norm," George repeated, crossing his arms and leaning further back in his chair. "Define that, Ethan." "An ordinary woman, someone who doesn't belong to that superficial world you love. Someone overweight, perhaps. Someone who would never catch your eye normally." The provocation drew laughter from the group, but George remained serious, analyzing Ethan's words. He knew his friend was trying to challenge him, to poke at his ego, and it worked. "And what's the prize in this ridiculous game?" Ethan took another sip of his drink before answering, looking around to make sure everyone was listening. "If you manage to win this woman over, marry her, and keep her interested for 6 months, we'll bankroll your next business venture, whatever that may be, but if you fail, we'll pay for ours." The others began to laugh and applaud, excited by the proposal. Some were already imagining the consequences, both financial and emotional, while Ethan watched George in silence, waiting for his reaction. George smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that indicated his acceptance of the challenge. He wasn't the kind of man to back down in the face of a provocation, especially such a public one. "Closed," he declared, holding out his hand to Ethan. The two shook hands, sealing the deal under the watchful eye of the group. The room erupted in celebration, the friends toasting and offering ideas on how George could fulfill his new mission. "You'll need luck," one of them commented, laughing. "This isn't like seducing a model in Cannes." "Maybe he needs more than luck," retorted another. "Maybe he needs to learn how to be human." The comments continued, but George remained silent, analyzing the challenge. For him, it was a game, He had already conquered women considered unattainable and closed impossible deals. This would be just one more task to add to the list of his victories. As the group celebrated the bet, Ethan watched him with a look that mixed amusement and something deeper. Perhaps even Ethan didn't know where it would end, but he knew that George was entering uncharted territory. The bet had been made, and George Grant was confident that he would win. What he didn't yet know was that he was about to embark on a journey that would change his life forever. The morning in the park was one of almost poetic tranquility. The blue sky was dotted with light clouds, while the breeze carried the fresh scent of the grass and the flowers that were beginning to bloom. Families strolled by, couples walked hand in hand, and joggers advanced along the well-kept paths. Among them, with a calculatedly casual appearance, was George Grant. He wore an impeccably cut grey sweater, combined with jeans that looked simple but cost more than many people's monthly salary. On his feet were a pair of discreet sneakers, carefully chosen to look ordinary, but belonging to an exclusive brand. George walked slowly, his hands in his pockets, his eyes attentive. The mission was clear: to find a woman who fit the profile described by Ethan. He had spent hours considering how to approach the task. It wouldn't be difficult. He knew how to manipulate conversations, build superficial connections, and attract anyone he wanted. George was a master at the game of seduction. But that morning, something seemed different. As he watched the park-goers, George realized that this world, so far removed from his bubble of wealth and luxury, had a simplicity that disoriented him. There were no lavish parties, flashy clothes, or expensive champagnes. People smiled at each other, genuinely. He didn't understand why, but something about the atmosphere made him feel out of place. Then he saw her. Charlotte Green was sitting on a wooden bench under the shade of a large tree. She held a book between her hands, her eyes fixed on the pages as if the world around her didn't exist. Her brown hair was tied up in a messy bun, and her glasses rested on the tip of her nose. She was wearing simple but comfortable clothes, a light blue blouse and cotton pants. Beside her, a bag with apples and a bottle of water suggested that she planned to spend some more time there. George stopped walking for a moment, his gaze fixed on her, trying to understand her before he even approached. Charlotte didn't fit the standard of beauty he used to admire. She didn't have the sophistication that the women in his circle proudly displayed, but there was something about her that intrigued him. Perhaps it was the tranquility with which she was immersed in her book, completely oblivious to the rest of the park. Perhaps it was the soft smile that appeared on her lips from time to time, as if she was savoring the written words. He took a deep breath and took a few steps towards her, adjusting his expression to something friendly, almost innocent. George knew how to approach someone without seeming invasive. "That book must be good to have you so focused," he commented, feigning curiosity. Charlotte looked up, slightly surprised, but then smiled politely. "Oh yes, it's one of my favorites," she replied, her voice calm and somewhat reserved. "May I ask which one it is?" George pointed to the book, sensing that it had gained his attention. Charlotte hesitated for a moment before showing him the cover. It was a classic novel, one that explored the complexities of love and loss. He recognized the title immediately, but decided to feign surprise. "Interesting. I've never read it, but I've always heard good things about it," he said, sitting down on the bench next to her, while keeping a respectful distance. Charlotte didn't know how to react. It was rare for strangers to approach her to strike up a conversation, even more so in such a gentle way. She felt torn between caution and curiosity. "I recommend it. It's a read that makes you think a lot about life," she replied, still keeping the conversation on a neutral level. George realized that Charlotte was different from the women he usually approached. She didn't seem interested in impressing him or prolonging the conversation, but she wasn't rude either. There was a subtle barrier between them, as if she were protecting something he couldn't yet see. He knew he had to proceed carefully. "You seem to enjoy reading a lot," George continued, trying to sound genuine. "I used to read a lot when I was younger, but now I feel like I've lost the habit. Perhaps you could help me get back into it by recommending some reading." Charlotte gave a slight smile. The idea that such a handsome man was interested in her opinions disconcerted her a little, but she saw no malice in it. "It depends on what you like. Some prefer action stories, others fantasy." "What about you?" interrupted George, feigning a deeper curiosity. "What makes you immerse yourself so deeply in a book that you forget the world around you?" Charlotte blushed slightly, surprised by the question. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, least of all from a stranger. I think I like stories that make me feel, something that challenges me to see the world in a different way. George absorbed her words, pretending to think about them while actually studying every detail of her expression. She was sincere, genuine in a way that disarmed him, but he remembered the bet and quickly regained his focus. The conversation continued, flowing surprisingly naturally. Charlotte began to relax, although she still maintained a certain emotional distance. George, on the other hand, noticed that every smile she gave him made him feel more invested in keeping her attention. When he finally said goodbye, after ensuring that he had planted the seed for a new encounter, George walked through the park with a mixture of satisfaction and discomfort. He felt he had taken the first step towards winning the bet, but he was imagining having to live with someone he had no interest in. Charlotte, for her part, stared into space for a while, trying to understand why this brief interaction had made her so uneasy. She was a woman used to being ignored, to going unnoticed. George's attention seemed too good to be true. The weeks following their first meeting in the park had been meticulously orchestrated by George Grant, a man who prided himself on his ability to manipulate the people around him like pieces on a chessboard. He had created a calculated routine of meetings with Charlotte, ensuring that she believed that fate had magically brought them together. Nothing in his approach was spontaneous. Every smile, every compliment, and every gesture of kindness had a single purpose: to win Charlotte over, to win the bet. From the start, George felt increasingly uncomfortable being around her. Charlotte was completely different from any woman he had ever met, and not in the way that could arouse interest or admiration. For George, Charlotte was a chore, an obstacle in his journey of self-promotion. He could barely disguise his irritation on first dates, but he knew he had to play his part to perfection. Behind the scenes, George was venting to Ethan and his friends about the difficulty of his mission. "She has nothing to do with me," he said, throwing himself into a leather armchair in his luxurious office. "It's a constant effort to pretend that I'm interested in, I don't know, books and social causes. Do you know how embarrassing it is to have to pretend to like that?" Ethan laughed, while the others were amused by George's desperation. "Are you making progress?" Ethan asked, with a mischievous grin. George sighed, swirling the wineglass in his hand. "Yes, of course, she's starting to trust me, which is the most important thing, but I'll tell you something. Spending so much time with someone like her is exhausting. I can hardly look at her without feeling like I'm wasting my time." The friends laughed, exchanging cruel jokes about Charlotte and the effort George was making to keep up the facade. "And she doesn't even know it?" asked one of them. "No idea," replied George with a satisfied smile. "She believes every word I say." From Charlotte's side, the view was completely different. For her, George was a kind, attentive man who was surprisingly interested in her passions and opinions. On walks in the park, he listened attentively as she talked about her favorite books. In cafes, he seemed fascinated by her stories about the students at the school where she worked. At every meeting, George made a point of showing how much he admired her, complimenting her on her intelligence, her kindness, and even her smile, even though inside he could hardly stand to be there. However, with each meeting, George felt the growing weight of his own hypocrisy. He wasn't interested in Charlotte. In fact, there were times when he felt an overwhelming sense of shame at being seen in public with her. Despite her impeccable acting, he avoided taking her to places frequented by his acquaintances. Take her to an expensive restaurant? No way, he confided to Ethan. "I prefer discreet places where no one knows me. I don't want any unnecessary explanations if someone sees me with her." But Charlotte didn't understand any of this. She was beginning to let down her defenses, something she rarely did. For the first time in years, she felt that perhaps she had found someone who saw her beyond her appearance. When George decided it was time to propose, he felt neither nervous nor excited. For him, it was just the next step in his strategy to win the bet. He planned the occasion as carefully as he did his business, choosing a discreet restaurant where no one he knew would see him, but which would still seem special to Charlotte. The evening was perfect, at least on the surface. George was dressed in casual elegance, while Charlotte had unknowingly chosen her most beautiful dress, a simple light blue that accentuated her eyes. She was nervous, wondering if this evening could be a milestone in their relationship. During dinner, George played his part masterfully, laughing at Charlotte's stories and pretending to be interested in her opinions. Inside, however, he was counting the minutes until the evening was over. Every smile she forced felt like a burden, and he had to fight the urge to roll his eyes whenever she talked about something that bored him. As dinner drew to a close, George realized that the time was right. He knew that, with the right amount of emotion, Charlotte wouldn't refuse. He knelt beside the table, feigning vulnerability as he held up a small box with a ring he had bought the same day, without any special consideration. "Charlotte, you've changed my life," he began, his voice soft but fake. "I never imagined meeting someone like you, someone so pure, so incredible." Charlotte stood paralyzed, staring at him with wide eyes as tears began to form. "I want to spend all my days by your side," George continued, feigning a warm smile. "Charlotte Green, will you marry me?" The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Charlotte was incredulous, trying to process what was happening. She had never felt so special, so valued. I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice trembling. "Say yes," George insisted, keeping his tone sweet but feeling impatient inside. After a moment, Charlotte finally nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, George, I accept." George stood up, feigning emotion as he hugged her. Charlotte felt that she had found the love she had always believed impossible, while George felt relieved to be one step closer to fulfilling his bet. That night, while Charlotte slept with a smile on her face, George was in his penthouse looking out over the city skyline. He felt no remorse, only a vague annoyance at having to subject himself to something so humiliating to prove his point. The morning of the wedding arrived with a cloudy sky, as if even the weather sensed the tension hanging over the ceremony. Charlotte woke up early in her small house, surrounded by her family. Her mother was beaming, fixing the last details of the dress that had been hastily fitted. It was a simple dress, borrowed from a distant cousin, but it had been carefully altered to make it look special. Charlotte looked at herself in the mirror with a mixture of joy and anxiety. With every passing moment, she tried to convince herself that this was the happiest day of her life. George was everything she had never imagined she could have, attentive, charming, and willing to see past her insecurities. Still, an inner voice whispered that something seemed out of place, but she silenced it. Insecurity had been her companion for so long that now she wanted to believe that love had finally found a way to her. At George's mansion, the mood was completely different. He was in his study, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt with a look of boredom. His tailored suit hung impeccably on his tall figure, but he didn't look pleased. He felt like an actor in a badly written play, playing a role he hated. Ethan entered the office without knocking, a cynical smile on his face. "Ready for the big day?" he asked, his voice full of sarcasm. George snorted, picking up the gold watch on the table and fastening it on his wrist. "What do you think?" he replied without hiding his irritation. "I'm getting married at an event so small it shouldn't even be called a wedding." Ethan laughed, moving closer and pouring himself a shot of whiskey. "That's what happens when you choose, how can I put it, out of the ordinary. Imagine if it were a grand ceremony. The press would be abuzz." George rolled his eyes. The idea of photographers and journalists covering the ceremony alongside Charlotte was unbearable for him. Not that she was a bad person. In fact, that was the problem. She was too good, too simple, so far removed from George's world that the very idea of introducing her as his wife seemed absurd. "That's why I only invited those who were absolutely necessary," said George, taking the glass of whiskey Ethan held out to him. "A few friends, my family, and, of course, her family. That's more than enough." At the ceremony site, a small, discreet chapel had been decorated with white flowers and gold details. It was elegant, but nothing compared to the grandiose events George used to attend. The decorations had been chosen by Charlotte, with the help of her mother and sister, who had spent the morning making sure everything was perfect. When George arrived at the venue, he walked with his usual haughty posture, but inside he felt uncomfortable. Every detail of the ceremony seemed to scream that he was out of place. As he waited for Charlotte to arrive, he looked around, observing the guests. To one side, his friends were sitting in a group, whispering and laughing discreetly. Ethan was in the center, exchanging sarcastic comments with the others, clearly enjoying the situation. "Is he really going to do this?" whispered one of the women, leaning towards Ethan. "It looks that way," replied Ethan, with a mischievous grin. "It's a good story to tell later, don't you think?" The group's muffled laughter echoed through the chapel, but George ignored it. He knew what they were thinking, but he was already determined to fulfill his bet. It didn't matter how uncomfortable the moment was. In the end, he would be victorious. On the other side, Charlotte's family was gathered, looking around with a mixture of admiration and discomfort. They had never been in such sophisticated surroundings, and the presence of George's wealthy friends made them feel even more out of place. But their eyes shone with pride when they saw Charlotte entering the chapel, holding the bouquet of flowers her sister had made. When Charlotte finally arrived at the altar, the two's opposite worlds became even more apparent. George, with his impeccable suit and calculated expression, and Charlotte, radiant in her simplicity, looking at him with a mixture of love and hope. The ceremony was brief. George barely heard the celebrant's words. His mind was occupied with the embarrassment of being there. He avoided looking at his friends, fearful of seeing the scorn and jokes on their faces. But when the moment came to say "I do," he did so with his usual firm voice and neutral expression, while Charlotte, her eyes brimming with tears, said the words with genuine emotion. The applause was timid, with the exception of Charlotte's family, who applauded enthusiastically, clearly moved. George forced a smile as he walked down the aisle beside Charlotte, feeling the weight of his choice, but not showing it. At the reception, the contrast between the two worlds became even more evident. Charlotte's family were in high spirits, chatting happily and admiring every detail of the decoration. George's friends, on the other hand, stood in a corner, laughing discreetly and exchanging scathing comments. Ethan, of course, didn't miss the opportunity to tease. "Congratulations, George," he said, raising his champagne glass. "Who knew you'd be the first of us to get married?" George only replied with a forced smile, while Charlotte chatted to one of her uncles, oblivious to Ethan's mischievous tone. As the evening drew to a close, George felt a huge sense of relief. The ceremony was over, and he had fulfilled another stage of the bet. As he said goodbye to the guests, he avoided thinking about what this meant for Charlotte, who believed she was starting a life with a man who loved her. But while Charlotte was getting ready for bed that night, her heart full of hope and love, George was in his study, pouring himself another shot of whiskey. For him, this was just another stage in a cruel game, a game in which he believed he was in control, but which little by little was beginning to show that not everything was under his control. The full moon cast its silvery light over George Grant's vast estate, where the mansion rose imposingly, surrounded by perfectly trimmed gardens. For Charlotte, the first few months of living there were like living in another world, a world that, although luxurious, was cold and full of silence. She was trying with all her might to find a space in that universe that didn't seem to have been made for her. Right after the wedding, Charlotte believed that George's love would be enough to overcome the barriers. He had shown her so much affection and dedication during their courtship, and she was convinced that, despite their differences, they could build a life together. But as the days turned into weeks, George's emotional distance began to become evident. At first it was subtle. He seemed distracted during conversations. Their glances became less frequent, and the touches that used to come naturally now seemed calculated, almost forced. Charlotte wondered if something was wrong, but tried to justify his behavior. As a result of his work and the pressures he faced, she spent her days exploring the mansion, which seemed too big for just two people. She tried to get used to the constant presence of staff, the oppressive silence of the corridors, and the absence of any sign of human warmth in that space. She engaged in small activities to make herself feel useful, such as decorating some of the rooms or looking after the flowers in the garden, but the loneliness was a constant burden. George, on the other hand, was immersed in his own internal battle. He hated to admit, even to himself, how uncomfortable he felt sharing the same space with Charlotte, although there was nothing wrong with her. In fact, she was so kind that it irritated him even more. He couldn't help feeling trapped. He had fulfilled his part of the bet by marrying her, but now he had to keep up the facade for 6 long months. The excuses started coming thick and fast. First, he claimed that he was a light sleeper and that sharing a bed made him tired the next day, thus justifying his decision to sleep in one of the guest rooms. "It's nothing personal, Charlotte," he said one evening, while collecting a pillow and some bedding. "It's just that I need to be rested for important meetings." Charlotte nodded, not knowing how to respond. She didn't want to create conflict, but the physical separation seemed the perfect reflection of the emotional distance that was growing between them. George started going out more often, claiming work commitments or meetings with friends. However, Charlotte knew that this was just an excuse. She often stayed up late, waiting to hear the sound of his footsteps returning. But when he finally arrived, it was almost always too late for a conversation. He would enter quietly, go straight up to the guest room and leave her alone with her doubts and insecurities. "Are you all right, dear?" asked Charlotte's mother during a phone call. Charlotte hesitated. She didn't want to worry her family, who had been so enthusiastic about the wedding. "Yes, Mom, I'm just adjusting to so many changes. But the truth was that she felt a silent ache with each passing day. What was supposed to be the start of a happy life seemed more like a cold, distant contract. Things began to change unexpectedly when George fell ill. He contracted a serious infection that left him weak, with a high fever and pain that kept him in bed for days. For the first time in months, he was vulnerable. When Charlotte learned of his condition, she immediately took on the responsibility of caring for him. She ignored the advice of the medical team George had hired and insisted on being by his side at all times. She prepared soups, checked his temperature, and sat by his bedside reading to him, even when he was unconscious from the fever. George, in his lucid moments, was bothered by her constant presence. He didn't want her to see him weak. He didn't want to depend on her for anything. "You don't have to do that, Charlotte," he murmured one evening, his voice hoarse. She just smiled, ignoring the cold tone in his voice. "I want to take care of you, George. That's what people do when they love someone." The word love hit him like a blow. He closed his eyes, pretending to fall asleep, but inside, his emotions were in turmoil. He didn't want to believe that Charlotte really cared about him. He didn't want to accept that, while all his friends had disappeared, without even sending a message to ask how he was, Charlotte was still there, unwavering. The days turned into weeks and George started to get better. During this time, he couldn't help but notice Charlotte's dedication. There was something about the way she cared for him, with genuine patience and kindness, that baffled him. She didn't seem to expect anything in return, which was something he had never experienced before. Even so, George fought against any feelings that threatened to arise. He kept telling himself that this was just part of the bet, that soon it would all be over, and he could resume his normal life. When he finally recovered, George went back to his usual routine, trying to pretend that nothing had changed. But deep down, something inside him was different. He began to pay more attention to Charlotte, to the little things she did, to the sacrifices she made without complaining. This bothered him because, for the first time, he felt that he wasn't in control. Charlotte, for her part, was still trying to find her place at George's side. Despite everything, she believed that he had begun to see her differently during his illness. She wanted to believe that with time, she could break down the barriers between them and build something real. But George, stubborn as ever, refused to admit any change in his feelings. For him, recognizing Charlotte's value would mean accepting that he was wrong about everything. About her, about himself, about the life he had chosen. And so the cycle of suffering continued, as they both tried to find meaning in a marriage that seemed doomed from the start. The day was particularly cold, with the sky covered in dense clouds that seemed to weigh down the mansion. Charlotte walked through the silent corridors, holding a bouquet of freshly picked flowers from the garden. It was a habit she had developed to bring a little color and warmth to the house, but that morning something seemed different. There was a tension in the air that she couldn't explain, an uncomfortable feeling that had been with her since the moment she woke up. George was in his office, as usual. After his recovery, he had plunged back into work, avoiding interaction with Charlotte as much as possible. He said it was important business, but Charlotte knew that most of the time, he just took refuge there to avoid facing the reality of his marriage. She tried not to take it personally, but the silences and distances began to weigh more heavily than she was willing to admit. She stopped in front of the office door, hesitating before knocking. She wanted to ask if he would like to have lunch together, something simple but meaningful to her. Before she could raise her hand, she heard voices coming from inside. "I know, Ethan, but it's almost over," said George, with a mixture of irritation and impatience in his voice. Charlotte frowned, leaning in slightly to hear better. George rarely spoke so openly with his friends at the mansion. He usually preferred to meet them in restaurants or at social events away from home. "No, she doesn't suspect anything," George continued, laughing bitterly. "Why should she? Charlotte believes everything I say." Charlotte froze. The mention of her name in that mocking tone made her heart race. "And you know what she's like, always so dedicated, so willing to do anything for me. It's almost pathetic, really." The words were like a stab in the chest. Charlotte recoiled instinctively, putting a hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. "Yes, the bet is practically won," George continued, without realizing he was being overheard. "A few more months and I'll be free of this." Charlotte felt as if the ground had disappeared from under her feet. The word bet echoed in her mind like thunder. For a moment, she couldn't move, the shock and pain taking over her body. Her mind tried desperately to understand what it meant, but her heart already knew. She clenched her fists, took a deep breath, and finally entered the office, pushing the door hard enough to startle George. He looked at her with wide eyes, clearly taken aback. "Charlotte, what are you doing here?" Charlotte's normally soft expression was distorted by pain and anger. "I could ask you the same question, George," she replied, her voice shaky but full of determination. "But I think I already know the answer." George stood up slowly, trying to regain control of the situation. "Charlotte, you're exaggerating." "Am I?" she retorted, taking a step forward. "So tell me, George, what exactly did you mean by the bet is practically won?" He was silent for a moment, searching for the right words, but Charlotte didn't give him any room to apologize. "It was all a lie, wasn't it? From the beginning, from the day we met. You never loved me." "Charlotte, listen to me," George began, but she interrupted him. "No!" she shouted, the tears finally streaming down her face. "I want to hear the truth, George. I want to hear you say in every word that I was just a game to you, that I was a joke to entertain you and your friends." George ran a hand through his hair, visibly frustrated. He knew he had been reckless to speak so openly to Ethan, but he never imagined that Charlotte would hear. Now, looking at her, seeing how much his words had destroyed her, he felt something he hadn't expected. Guilt. "Charlotte," he began again, but the pain in her eyes silenced him. "How could you do this to me?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "I trusted you, George. I loved you." George looked away, unable to face her. He had spent his whole life avoiding real connections, treating people as disposable pieces in his personal game. But Charlotte wasn't like the others. She was different. And now, seeing her broken because of his actions, he realized how much that mattered, even if he didn't want to admit it. "It was a bet," he finally confessed, his voice low and full of shame. "At first it was just that, a bet." Charlotte staggered backwards as if she had taken a physical blow. "So it's true," she said, almost to herself. George took a step forward, trying to reach her, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Don't you dare," she said, with a firmness he had never seen before. "Don't touch me." He stopped, feeling helpless for the first time in his life. "Charlotte, let me explain." "Explain what?" she interrupted, her voice laced with bitterness. "That I was just a diversion for you, that you faked every smile, every word, every touch. In the beginning, maybe it was like that," George admitted, but his words only intensified her pain. Charlotte shook her head as if to ward off the truth. "I was a fool," she said, more to herself than to him. "I believed in you. I thought that maybe I'd finally found someone who really saw me." George felt his throat tighten. He wanted to say something, anything, to ease the pain he had caused, but the words wouldn't come. "I don't know how I'm going to move on after this, George," Charlotte continued, her voice weak but still full of emotion. "But I do know one thing. I never want to see you again." She left the office, leaving George alone with the weight of her actions. For the first time, he felt the true impact of what he had done. It wasn't just the loss of Charlotte that shook him. It was the realization that, in his quest to win a bet, he had destroyed something that could never be repaired. The morning sun seemed to shine without purpose, its warm lights illuminating the cold, silent mansion that George Grant now inhabited alone. Charlotte had left the night before, taking with her nothing but a small suitcase and a gaping wound that no amount of time seemed able to heal. He could still hear the echoes of her words, the pain in her voice, and the devastated look she had given him before walking out the door. George was sitting on the large leather sofa in the main room, a glass of whiskey in his hand, despite the early hour. The mansion had never seemed so big, so empty. The luxurious furnishings, the works of art hanging on the walls, and the huge windows overlooking the impeccably tended gardens were now just reminders of a life he had built with facade and coolness. He thought of Charlotte and the cutting silence that had followed her departure. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't thrown anything at him. Their farewell had been marked by silent tears and words so painful that they still felt like blades on his skin. "I loved you, George, but you never really saw me." Those words haunted him. He knew they were true, but the sincerity in them, the intensity with which she accused him of being empty and cruel, shook him in a way he didn't fully understand. He had spent his whole life believing that he didn't need to care, that feelings were just obstacles in the quest for power, status, and fun. George looked at the glass in his hand and set it aside with an irritated gesture. For the first time in a long time, the alcohol didn't seem enough to numb the pain. He closed his eyes, trying to push the memories away, but they kept coming back. He saw her in the garden, her delicate hands tending the flowers as if they were precious. He remembered her sitting on the sofa, lost in a book, her face illuminated by the afternoon light. He remembered how she always looked at him with a smile, even when he barely noticed her. All that now seemed distant, like a dream he had destroyed with his own hands. While George struggled with his thoughts, Charlotte was sitting on a bus, heading back to her family's small house. The journey was long and silent, and she spent the time staring out of the window, watching the landscapes pass quickly by like a reflection of her recent life. She held the bus ticket tightly, her knuckles white. It wasn't the ticket she was clutching, but her pain, her humiliation, and her anger. Charlotte had never imagined that she could feel so broken. For months, she had believed that she had found something special, something that could defy all odds. But it was all just a lie. When the bus arrived at its destination, her mother was waiting for her at the small station. When she saw Charlotte getting off, carrying a suitcase, and with eyes swollen from crying, the woman knew that something was terribly wrong. "Charlotte," began her mother, her voice full of concern. Charlotte tried to smile, but her lips trembled. She fell into her mother's arms, letting the tears flow freely. "He wasn't who I thought he was, Mom," she managed to say through sobs. "I was just a game to him." Her mother held her tightly, stroking her hair and whispering words of comfort. They walked together to the house, where Charlotte finally felt safe enough to let go completely. In the days that followed, Charlotte tried to get her life back on track. She went back to teaching at the local school, spent her afternoons helping her mother at home, and got back into the habit of reading her favorite books. But nothing seemed the same. Every corner of the house, every page of a book, every conversation with a friend reminded her of George, of his smile, his sweet words, his touches that now seemed so fake. Meanwhile, George was beginning to face the consequences of his actions. He had shunned his friends, especially Ethan, who was responsible for planting the idea of the bet. For the first time, Ethan's laughter and sarcastic comments seemed unbearable. George spent hours in his office, mentally reviewing every interaction he had with Charlotte. He wondered how he had been able to look at her, listen to her laughter, and share such intimate moments without feeling the weight of her lies. He remembered the night she took care of him while he was ill, how she read to him and looked at him with genuine concern. "I didn't deserve that," he muttered to himself, feeling a lump in his throat. He knew that Charlotte was the only person in his life who had treated him like a real person, not like a powerful figure or a resource to be exploited. But he had destroyed that, and the thought of never seeing her again tormented him. One night, unable to bear the loneliness and regret, George picked up the phone and dialed Charlotte's number. The sound of the call echoed like a hammer in his head, but no one answered. He tried again, but the result was the same. She had disappeared from his life, and he didn't know how to get her back. The days turned into weeks, and George continued to live in a mansion that was now more like a mausoleum. Every empty room, every lonely dinner, every silent morning served as a reminder of what he had lost. Charlotte, for her part, found comfort in the simplicity of her old life. Although she was still wounded, she began to rediscover the strength she thought she had lost. She didn't know what the future held, but she was determined never again to allow anyone to treat her as less than she deserved. Meanwhile, George, isolated in his mansion, was beginning to understand something he had never admitted before. He had fallen in love with Charlotte in spite of himself, but for him, it seemed too late. The morning at George's mansion began like all the others since Charlotte had left, silent, cold, and immersed in an almost palpable emptiness. The man who used to wake up with his mind full of plans and strategies was now up late, moving around the house like a shadow of himself. He avoided the mirror not out of vanity, but because he couldn't stand the sight of a man who finally recognized the extent of his mistakes. George spent days locked in his office, immersed in reports and contracts that couldn't hold his attention for long. Everything around him reminded him of Charlotte in some way. The bouquet of wilted flowers in the vase she insisted on filling, the books she had left stacked on the coffee table, and even the heavy air that filled the house, a reflection of the emotional burden he now carried. That morning, he decided to do something different. It wasn't a planned decision, but an impulse. He dressed in simple clothes, grabbed his car keys, and set off, without a clear destination. He drove for hours, passing busy streets and humbler neighborhoods, until the sound of children playing caught his attention. He stopped in front of a community school, a modest building with colorful walls and a small garden at the entrance. George felt a pang of curiosity, followed by a strange desire to observe. He knew that Charlotte had worked in places like this, and for the first time, he thought about what her life must have been like before she met him. He parked the car, and even though he felt out of place, got out. The laughter and happy voices of children filled his ears as he walked hesitantly to the gate. A middle-aged woman with a kind expression approached him. "Can I help you?" she asked, with a smile that seemed genuinely welcoming. George hesitated. It was rare that he was greeted without looks of interest or flattery. "I just wanted to know more about the school," he said, his voice softer than he had intended. The woman introduced herself as the principal and enthusiastically explained the work carried out there. She talked about the financial challenges, the positive impact the volunteers made, and the importance of every little contribution. As he listened, George realized that he had never thought about the world beyond his own privileges. He was used to measuring everything in numbers, profits, and advantages, but there, in that humble school, he saw something that seemed real: effort, dedication, and a sense of purpose that he had never known. In the days that followed, George returned to the school. He began discreetly, making small anonymous donations for urgent repairs, such as repairing the roof and buying new school materials. However, something inside him wanted more. He didn't just want to write checks. He wanted to be a part of it. He decided to personally help with one of the school's fundraising campaigns. It was the first time he had really gotten involved in something without expecting anything in return. The job wasn't easy. He felt uncomfortable being just another volunteer without the special treatment he was used to. At first, the others looked at him suspiciously, finding it strange that a man like him was there. But little by little, George began to blend in. He chatted with the children, helped organize activities, and, without realizing it, began to really smile. Meanwhile, he also began to reflect on the friends he had previously considered indispensable. Ethan, in particular, was a presence that George began to avoid. After the bet, Ethan's sarcastic and mocking behavior became unbearable. He realized that the jokes and conversations he used to find amusing now sounded empty and cruel. During a dinner in which Ethan tried to convince him to take part in yet another adventure, George finally broke the silence. "I'm out," George said firmly. Ethan looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean you're out?" "I mean that I'm tired of it, Ethan. The betting, the playing games at other people's expense. I don't see the fun in it anymore." Ethan laughed, but his laugh was strained. "Are you saying this because of that woman? Did she make you soft?" Ethan's words were an echo of who George had once been, but now they sounded repulsive. He stood up, throwing his napkin on the table. "No, Ethan, I'm saying this because I've realized that living like this isn't worth it." And he left the restaurant, leaving behind a piece of himself that he no longer wanted to carry. As time went by, George began to make real changes in his life. He reduced his attendance at empty social events, devoting more time to causes he had previously ignored. He made substantial donations to charities, but always discreetly. He visited the school regularly, helping in any way he could, and learning more about the impact of his work. For the first time, he felt he was building something that wasn't just for himself. In the midst of these transformations, George began to understand something he had avoided admitting for a long time. He missed Charlotte, not just for who she was, but for what she brought to his life. Her kindness, her strength, and her authenticity were things he had never valued until he lost them. Even so, he knew it wasn't enough to want her back. He needed to be someone worthy of her love, someone she could respect. And for the first time, George was willing to work for it, not out of obligation, but because it was the right thing to do. One evening, while walking through the gardens of the mansion, he stopped in front of one of the rose bushes that Charlotte had planted. The flowers were blooming as a silent reminder of her presence. He picked up a rose and held it carefully, feeling the soft petals under his fingers. "Charlotte," he murmured to himself, feeling the weight of her name on his lips. "I'm so sorry." And at that moment, George knew that his journey of redemption had only just begun. The morning was sunny, and the small community school buzzed with the energy of the children. Charlotte Green, wearing a dirt-stained apron and her hair in a loose bun, was helping the children plant seedlings in the school garden. She looked radiant, her skin brighter, her posture more confident, and her eyes, those same eyes that had carried sadness months ago, now reflected a serenity she had found on her journey of rebuilding. After months dedicated to herself, Charlotte wasn't just a physically healthier version of herself, she was a woman transformed from the inside. The emotional and physical recovery process had brought clarity and self-confidence, something no one could take away from her. Her life revolved around the work she loved, the deep connections with her family, and the impact she made on the community. On the other side of the school gate, standing with his hands in his pockets and his heart squeezed, was George Grant. He watched Charlotte from afar, but for a moment he found it hard to recognize her. She looked different, not just physically, thinner, with a face softened by her changing habits, but in her presence. Charlotte carried an air of security, as if she had finally found a place where she belonged. George felt the weight of the moment. He knew he couldn't just show up and ask for forgiveness. Charlotte had grown up without him, and that terrified him. Taking a deep breath, he took a step towards the gate, aware that everything in his life depended on that conversation. Charlotte noticed him before he spoke. Her expression of surprise was followed by a look of caution. She hadn't expected to see him there, and the sight of George brought a wave of conflicting emotions. "What are you doing here, George?" she asked, her voice firm but not angry. He stopped a few steps away, not knowing how to begin. His eyes sought hers, but she didn't give in. I needed to see you," he replied hesitantly. Charlotte crossed her arms, clearly protecting herself emotionally. "Why? Haven't we done this before? Didn't you get what you wanted?" Her words cut deep, but George knew he deserved them. He shook his head. "I'm not here to deceive you again. I'm here because I need to be honest." She arched an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "I ruined everything, Charlotte. Right from the start. I hurt you in a way that I'll never be able to repair, but I want to try, to be someone you can at least respect." Charlotte remained silent, her eyes evaluating every word he said. "Do you have any idea what it cost me to leave that place, George?" she asked, her voice low but full of emotion. "Believing in you was the hardest thing I've ever done, and you destroyed that." George nodded, feeling the guilt weigh on him like never before. "I know," he said, his voice shaking, "and I don't expect you to forgive me now, maybe ever, but I need you to know that everything that happened showed me how empty my life was, and you, Charlotte, even without realizing it, were the only real thing I ever had." She blinked, clearly taken aback by his words, but remained cautious. "That's easy to say now." George took a step forward, but stopped when he saw Charlotte move slightly away. "I was won over by you, Charlotte, not by what you looked like, but by who you were inside, by the way you cared, even though I was so unbearable. It doesn't matter what you look like, your weight, or anything else. It matters who you are, and I need that in my life." Charlotte felt her heart squeeze, but she didn't allow herself to give in so easily. "People don't change that quickly, George," she replied with cold calm. "How do I know this isn't just another attempt to fix your wounded ego?" George took a deep breath, gathering the courage to answer. "I know I can't change the past, but since you've been gone, I've started to see what I never saw before. I've distanced myself from people like Ethan. I've started to devote myself to things that really matter. I made donations to schools like this one because it was here that I understood what you valued." Charlotte stared at him, her emotions oscillating between skepticism and surprise. "Donations?" He nodded, looking embarrassed. "Not to impress you, but because it was the right thing to do. You showed me what it means to care about something bigger than your own vanity." Charlotte looked away, trying to process his words. For months, she had tried to forget him, convincing herself that he was incapable of change. But now, seeing him there, vulnerable and more human than she had ever seen him, she didn't know what to think. "I can't just forget everything that's happened, George," she said at last, her voice shaking. "It will take time, and I can't promise anything." George nodded with a sincere look on his face. "I don't expect promises. I just want a chance to show that I'm willing to change." Over the next few days, George stayed in town, getting involved in the school activities and the charity initiatives that Charlotte led. He never forced meetings or conversations, just showed his dedication through actions. Charlotte watched from afar, still wary, but something inside her began to soften. She saw the way he dealt with the children, his patience with the volunteers, and even the humility with which he accepted simple tasks, such as cleaning the yard or organizing donations. One evening, while the two of them were working side by side on a food drive, Charlotte broke the silence. "You've changed, George." He paused, surprised by her words, but didn't smile. "I hope it's enough for you to trust me one day." Charlotte was silent for a moment, then looked at him. "Trust takes time, and I need to believe that you're doing this for you, not for me." George nodded, understanding the depth of what she was saying. "I'm doing it for us," he replied sincerely. Charlotte didn't reply, but for the first time in months, she allowed a small smile to escape. The morning was quiet in the small town, but in the greenhouse the mood was anxious. Charlotte woke up before the sun, as she had done since returning to her old life. She prepared breakfast while listening to the radio playing soft music. However, something seemed different that day. An uneasiness was growing in her chest, a foreboding that important decisions were to come. Charlotte had spent months rebuilding her life, reconnecting with her family and rediscovering who she was. Now faced with the possibility of making room for George again, she couldn't help the flood of conflicting thoughts. There was love, yes, but also pain and fear. She sat at the table with her cup of tea, staring into the slowly rising steam as she weighed up the pros and cons of giving George a second chance. Her mother's voice, as she entered the kitchen, brought her back to reality. "Daughter, you seem distant. Is something worrying you?" Charlotte hesitated for a moment before answering. "He came to see me again, Mom. He said he's changed, that he wants to try and start again." Charlotte's mother sat down opposite her, her expression a mixture of concern and tenderness. "And what do you think of that?" Charlotte sighed. "I don't know. He seems different, but how can I be sure? He's lied before, and I don't know if I can go through that again." Charlotte's mother held her hands. "You're the only one who can decide that, my love. But before you do anything, ask yourself, are you willing to take that risk?" The words echoed in Charlotte's mind for the rest of the day. She continued her routine at school, organizing the children's activities and helping out in the library. But George's face and the memories of the last few months wouldn't leave her mind. Meanwhile, George was at school, helping to collect materials for a fundraising campaign. During a conversation with one of the children, a touching moment happened. A little girl called Anna, just 8 years old, tugged on his shirt. "Mr. George, Miss Charlotte said that you helped us repair the school roof, is that true?" George smiled, surprised by the simplicity of the question. "Yes, Anna, I wanted to help because this school is very special." The girl hugged him without warning and looked at him with sparkling eyes. "Thank you. Miss Charlotte says that good people make the world better. You must be a good person now." George stood still for a moment, overcome by a wave of emotion that almost made him cry. Those words, coming from a child, meant more than he could express. At the end of the day, Charlotte returned home to find her younger sister, Emily, waiting for her in the living room. "Mum told me that George showed up," Emily said bluntly. "Are you really thinking of giving him another chance?" Charlotte hesitated before answering. "I don't know, Emily. He seems to have changed, but how can I be sure?" Emily shook her head, her face full of concern. "You've already suffered so much, Charlotte. I don't want to see you go through it again." Charlotte felt a tightness in her chest. She knew that Emily only wanted to protect her, but those words increased her indecision even more. While Charlotte faced her dilemma, George continued to plan something that would show her how much he was willing to fight for her love. He decided to organize a special surprise, involving the school children and the community, who now admired Charlotte as much as he did. The next morning, Charlotte was called to school with the excuse of an emergency meeting. When she arrived, she found the courtyard decorated with flowers and balloons, the children holding colorful signs that read, "Thank you, Charlotte, for inspiring us." George was there next to them, with a shy smile. "I know words aren't enough," he said, coming closer. "That's why I thought I should show you, with actions, how much you've changed my life and the lives of so many people around you." Charlotte looked around, feeling tears come to her eyes. She saw how much the children admired her, how grateful the community was for her dedication, and at that moment she realized that George had really learned what it meant to love and value something beyond himself. "I didn't do anything on my own," she said, her voice shaking. George shook his head. "You've done more than you know, Charlotte. You showed me what really matters. No matter how much I've changed, what I do know is that I don't want a life without you." Charlotte looked at him, seeing the man he had become. There was sincerity in his eyes, something she had never seen before. "I won't forget what happened, George. Trust takes time." "I know," he replied, "and I'm willing to spend as long as it takes to win back your heart." Charlotte smiled, finally feeling the weight in her chest begin to ease. "Then maybe we can try." George took a deep breath, feeling a wave of relief and happiness wash over him. He knew that this was only the beginning, but he was ready to do the work necessary to build a future with Charlotte. In the months that followed, they began to rebuild their relationship. Charlotte remained focused on her life and her passions, while George dedicated himself to supporting her efforts and being a true partner. They learned to trust each other, facing challenges together with honesty and mutual respect. And so, under the sunset in a park where it all began, George held Charlotte's hand and smiled. "Thank you for believing in me again." She squeezed his hand, looking at him with a sparkle in her eyes. "Thank you for proving that people can change." The new chapter of their lives was just beginning, But this time, they both knew they were building something real and lasting. If you like this story and want to see more like it, subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Don't miss the video that's appearing on your screen right now. Click to continue following stories that will move you.